There are some sounds that do not belong to the living world. They do not come from throats meant for breath, nor from mouths shaped by ordinary grief. They rise instead from the margins, from the places where night presses close against memory, and they carry with them a weight that cannot be mistaken. In Ireland, such a sound has a name, and that name is spoken quietly even now. The Banshee. She is not a monster crouched in shadow, nor a demon shrieking for blood. She is not a hunter, nor a killer, nor a curse loosed upon the innocent. She is something older and sadder and far more intimate. She is a voice, a warning, a lament that arrives before the candle gutters out, before the breath thins, before the house knows it will soon be a place of mourning. For centuries, Irish people believed that death did not come unannounced. It was preceded by signs, subtle or terrible, and among the most feared and respected of these signs was the cry of a woman not of this world. When her voice rose at night, high, broken, unearthly, it was understood that someone, somewhere nearby, was already stepping toward the threshold between life and whatever lies beyond. She did not come for everyone. She did not cry for strangers. She came only for certain families, bound to them by blood, land, and memory, following their line through generations like a shadow that never entirely lifts. The Banshee belongs to the old Ireland, the Ireland of scattered farmhouses and long nights, of stories spoken by the hearth and silence that pressed heavily once the fire burned low. She belongs to a time when death occurred at home, not behind hospital doors, and when grief was shared openly, loudly, and communally. Her cry is the echo of that older world, a world where sorrow was not hidden away, but sung into the dark. To hear her was to know that death had already chosen. To see her, rarer still, was to glimpse the edge of the other world brushing against the familiar. And yet, for all the terror she inspired, she was not hated. She was feared, yes, but also understood. She was not the bringer of death, but its herald. She did not take life, she announced its leaving. In the modern imagination, the Banshee has been twisted into something else entirely. She is portrayed as violent, malicious, even predatory. Her scream kills, her presence curses. But these inventions say more about modern fears than about the figure herself. In traditional belief, the Banshee is grief made audible. She is the sound of love mourning in advance. This video moves through her world, through her origins, her appearances, her voice, and the families she follows. It listens to what she does and why she does it, and it asks why she has grown quieter as the centuries have passed. Above all, it returns the Banshee to her rightful place, not as a creature of horror, but as a sorrowful messenger standing at the crossroads of life and death, singing the oldest song Ireland knows. Long before the Banshee became a solitary figure wandering the edges of farms and villages, she belonged to a much broader and stranger landscape. Her roots lie deep in Ireland's mythic past, in a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead were thin, shifting, and often permeable. To understand her origins is to step into that liminal terrain where gods faded into spirits and spirits learned to walk among humans. The very name by which she is known reveals her nature. She is not simply a ghost nor a wandering soul. She is a woman of the other world, tied not to graves, but to the invisible realm that exists alongside the human one. This realm was not imagined as distant or abstract. It lay beneath hills, within ancient mounds, behind hedgerows and beneath still water. It was entered accidentally, stumbled into at twilight, brushed against during moments of deep emotion or transition. The beings who dwelled there were not dead in the human sense. They were older than death, older even than humanity's memory of itself. When Ireland's earliest stories speak of divine figures retreating from the surface of the world, they describe not an extinction, but a withdrawal. These beings did not vanish. They changed. They became watchers, guardians, and sometimes mourners. The Banshee may be one of these transformed figures. In some traditions, she is remembered as having once been radiant and powerful, a presence associated with battlefields and fate. Over time, as gods diminished and stories shifted, that power narrowed, focusing inward, becoming personal rather than cosmic. What remained was the function of witness. She no longer decided who would die. She simply knew when death was near. Another thread in her origin ties her to human ritual. In ancient Ireland, mourning was not a quiet affair. Women gathered to keen over the dead, raising voices in complex, improvised laments that named the deceased, praised their life, and expressed the community's loss. These keeners were not merely performers. They were conduits for grief, speaking what others could not. Their cries were believed to guide the dead safely away, to honor them properly, and to prevent restless spirits from lingering. The Banshee can be seen as the spirit of this practice made eternal. She is the keener who never leaves, who arrives before the body cools, whose voice anticipates the wake rather than responding to it. In this sense, she's not foreign to humanity, but born of its customs. She's the sound of mourning lifted out of time. This dual origin, half divine, half human, explains much about her nature. She is neither benevolent nor malevolent. She does not judge. She does not punish. She performs a role, one shaped by ancient belief and sustained by repetition. Her presence is not random. It is precise, inherited, almost contractual. Families who believe themselves followed by a banshee often trace that connection back centuries. The spirit was said to attach herself to a lineage, not because of wrongdoing, but because of history. Bloodlines that had held land for generations, that had seen war, famine, and exile, carried with them an accumulation of sorrow. The Banshee was the embodiment of that accumulated grief, manifesting whenever one more name was about to be added to the long list of the dead. She did not appear in cities or among the newly arrived. She belonged to the old families, the ones whose roots were sunk deep into the soil. Even when members of those families left Ireland, it was said that the Banshee still cried at the ancestral home, as if bound to the land rather than to the flesh. This connection to place is central to her origin. She is not a wanderer in the true sense. She moves, but within limits. Her paths follow rivers, roads, and fields that have been walked for centuries. She stands by windows not because she needs to look inside, but because windows are thresholds, places where inside and outside meet. She appears at fords and crossroads because these are points of transition, places where one thing becomes another. As Ireland changed, so did the way people spoke of her. In earlier centuries, her presence was woven naturally into life. She was frightening, but expected. Later, as belief in the other world waned, she became a story told about the past, a relic of a darker, more superstitious age. And yet, even as skepticism grew, the image of the crying woman endured. Something in her resonated too deeply to disappear. Perhaps this is because the Banshee represents a truth that modernity has not erased, that death is not sudden or isolated, but part of a continuum. That loss reverberates backward and forward through time. That grief does not begin when someone dies, but before, in the quiet knowledge that everyone must. The Banshee stands at that moment of knowing. She is the sound of inevitability given voice. Her origin is not simply mythological, it is emotional. She exists because humans have always needed a way to hear death approaching, to prepare themselves, however helplessly, for the pain that follows. In the old stories, she does not explain herself. She does not justify her presence. She cries because crying is what must be done. In this, she is truer than any monster, and more unsettling than any villain. She reminds those who hear her that death is not an interruption, but a continuation, and that someone, somewhere, is always already mourning. Long before the Banshee is ever seen, she is heard. Sound is her true body, and her cry is the shape she takes most faithfully. It travels farther than any figure could walk, slipping through hedges, across fields, along rivers, and into houses where doors are shut and fires burn low. Those who have heard it insist that it cannot be mistaken for anything else. It is not an animal, it is not the wind, it is not human, and yet it is saturated with humanity. It carries intention, it carries grief. The cry is often described as keening, but that word only gestures toward its complexity. Keening, in the human tradition, was a formal act of mourning, a vocal expression of loss that followed no fixed melody but obeyed its own internal logic. It rose and fell, repeated names, lingered on certain sounds as if reluctant to let them go. The banshee's cry resembles this, but stripped of language. It is keening without words, grief without explanation. It does not say who will die. It does not say when. It announces only that the boundary has been crossed in some invisible way and that death has already begun its slow approach. Those who hear it often describe an immediate physical reaction. The sound raises the hair on the arms, it tightens the chest, it produces a cold that seems to move through the bones rather than across the skin. Even people who claim not to believe in such things describe feeling watched, singled out, as if the sound itself knows them. This is part of what makes the banshee's cry so enduring in memory. It does not merely frighten, it implicates. The quality of the cry varies. Sometimes it is low and mournful, a steady lament that seems to drift endlessly, as though the banshee herself is walking as she cries, carrying her grief from place to place. At other times it is sharp and piercing, rising suddenly into a scream that shatters the night. In these moments it is less like mourning and more like raw anguish, the sound of something torn open. Some accounts speak of the cry changing as it goes on, beginning softly and swelling into something unbearable, as though the banshee is losing control of her own sorrow. It is often heard at night, particularly in the hours before dawn, when the world is quietest and most vulnerable. Darkness sharpens the sound, strips away context. A cry heard in daylight might be dismissed, explained away, but at night it has nothing to compete with. It arrives unchallenged. People lying awake in bed would hear it and know, with a certainty that defied reason, that it was meant for them or for someone near them. Even when the death did not occur immediately, the cry lingered in the mind, waiting to be proven true. There is a reason the banshee cries rather than speaks. Speech belongs to the living world. It requires breath, intention, response. The banshee's lament belongs to a different register. It is a sound that exists outside conversation. It does not invite dialogue or comfort. It does not ask to be understood. It simply exists. Like the sound of waves breaking against rocks or wind moving through trees, except that it carries meaning rather than indifference. In older Ireland, people were accustomed to listening. Nights were long and silence was deep. Sounds traveled farther. The cry of an animal, the creak of wood, the rush of water in a stream could all be heard clearly. Against this backdrop, the banshee's wail stood out not because it was loud, but because it was wrong. It did not fit the natural order. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing without a source. Some believe that the banshee did not cry from one place, but moved as she keened, circling the house or following the path that death would soon take. Others believe that her voice could pass through walls and windows without her body ever being present. In many stories, no one ever sees her at all. The sound alone is enough. This emphasis on sound over sight is significant. The banshee is not meant to be confronted. She's not meant to be chased away or reasoned with. Her power lies in the fact that she announces something that cannot be altered. To hear her is to be reminded of one's helplessness in the face of mortality. Vision invites action. Sound invites acceptance. The cry also mirrors the emotional reality of death more closely than any visual sign could. Grief often arrives before loss is fully realized. There is a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes drawn out, when one knows that someone is dying even before the moment comes. The banshee's cry occupies that moment. It is anticipatory grief given voice. There are accounts of people hearing the cry and dismissing it, only to remember it later with a chill. The sound becomes meaningful in retrospect, retroactively transformed from a frightening noise into a message that had been delivered and ignored. This delayed recognition is part of the banshee's power. She does not demand belief. She allows disbelief, knowing it will not matter in the end. The banshee's keening is also deeply tied to the land. Her voice seems to rise more easily from certain places, from bogs, rivers, hills, and old roads. Water, in particular, plays a role. Many describe hearing the cry near streams or lakes, places associated with transition and passage. Water carries sound in strange ways, bending it, amplifying it, making it seem closer or farther than it is. In this way, the environment collaborates with the banshee, shaping her lament and extending its reach. In Scotland, where a related figure washes death clothes by the water's edge, the sound of splashing and beating fabric blends with the keening, reinforcing the connection between sound, water, and death. The rhythmic slap of cloth against stone becomes another form of lament, a physical echo of the vocal cry. Even in Ireland, some traditions speak of hearing not only the banshee's voice, but also the sound of movement, as though she is working, preparing something unseen. The cry is sometimes said to contain hints of words, though no one can quite make them out. People speak of hearing names or fragments of speech, but never clearly enough to repeat. This ambiguity heightens the fear. If the banshee named the one who would die, the horror would be immediate and complete. Instead, she leaves space for doubt, for hope, for denial. The listener is left to wonder who the cry is for, scanning the household in their mind, counting the living. Despite the terror it inspires, the banshee's cry is not cruel. It does not mock or threaten. It does not linger for pleasure. It expresses grief, and grief alone. This is why, in traditional belief, it was not considered an evil sound. It was frightening because death is frightening, not because the banshee wished harm. In some stories, multiple cries are heard together, rising and falling in a kind of terrible harmony. This is said to occur when someone of great importance is about to die, as though more than one banshee has gathered to mourn. The sound in these accounts is overwhelming, filling the air completely, leaving no silence behind. It is grief magnified, grief made communal. What is striking in all these traditions is the respect given to the cry. People did not shout back. They did not attempt to drown it out. They listened. They waited. The sound was allowed to finish in its own time, after which the night would return to its ordinary quiet, now charged with expectation. In a world without modern medicine, death was both familiar and unpredictable. People lived close to it, but never fully accustomed themselves to its arrival. The banshee's cry provided a framework for that uncertainty. It placed death within a narrative, turning it from a sudden rupture into a process with a beginning. The cry marked that beginning. As belief in the banshee faded, the cry did not disappear entirely. People continued to describe inexplicable sounds in the night and continued to associate them with death, even if they no longer named them as such. The banshee's voice slipped into metaphor, into language itself. To scream like a banshee became a way of describing extreme anguish. The phrase preserved the sound, even as belief in its source waned. And yet, for those who still listen closely to old stories, the cry remains unmistakable. It is not simply loud, it is not simply sad, it is purposeful grief, arriving before its cause is fully visible. It is the sound of mourning stepping ahead of time, waiting for reality to catch up. The banshee does not cry because she enjoys sorrow. She cries because crying is what marks the passage from one state of being to another. Her keening is the bridge between life and death, stretched thin and trembling in the dark. If the banshee's cry is the sound of grief, her appearance is its embodiment. Yet no single shape contains her. She is changeable, inconsistent, and deeply local, appearing as each place and generation understands sorrow best. Those who claim to have seen her often struggle to describe her clearly, not because she is indistinct, but because she seems to exist slightly out of alignment with the world around her, as though her form is never fully settled. Most often, she appears alone. This solitude is essential to her nature. She does not arrive in groups or entourages. She does not mingle. When she is seen, she is isolated against the landscape, a single figure where no one should be. A woman by a river at night. A silhouette at a window where no one stands. A hunched shape on a wall or by a gate, unmoving until suddenly gone. The most common image is that of an old woman. She is bent, thin, and worn, her age difficult to measure, but clearly beyond the ordinary span. Her hair hangs long and loose, usually white or gray, unbound and uncombed, except when she herself is combing it. In traditional Irish culture, women bound their hair tightly. To wear it loose was a sign of mourning, madness, or both. The banshee's hair is always loose. It falls around her face like a curtain, hiding her expression as if grief itself has obscured her features. Her clothing, too, marks her as belonging to no ordinary household. She wears long garments that seem old-fashioned even in memory, often gray, white, or black. Sometimes her cloak is described as tattered, as though it has weathered centuries. Other times it is pale and luminous, catching the moonlight in a way that makes her appear faintly unreal. These colors are not arbitrary. Gray and white are the colors of ash and bone, of things that remain after life has burned away. They are also the colors of mourning and transition. In some accounts, her eyes are red, swollen from endless weeping. In others, they shine unnaturally, reflecting light like an animal's in the dark. There are descriptions of her face being twisted with sorrow, mouth open mid-cry, features contorted beyond what a human face could sustain. And yet there are also stories in which her face is beautiful, even serene, her grief contained rather than explosive. This variation is not a contradiction. It reflects the dual nature of the banshee as both ancient and immediate. In places where the memory of old gods lingers, she appears as a young woman, tall and radiant, with long fair hair and a presence that commands attention rather than repulsion. In such stories, her sorrow is quiet, dignified, the grief of someone who has seen countless deaths and carries them all. In places where hardship and poverty shaped daily life, she appears as a hag, mirroring the exhaustion of generations worn down by loss. Between these extremes are countless intermediate forms. She may appear middle-aged, neither young nor ancient, dressed plainly, blending easily into the landscape until she begins to cry. She may be mistaken at first for a washerwoman, a beggar, or a widow. Only when she vanishes too suddenly, or when her cry begins, does her true nature become clear. One of the most persistent elements of her appearance is the act of combing her hair. She's often seen sitting quietly, drawing a comb through her long hair with slow, deliberate strokes. This act is deeply symbolic. In life, combing the hair is an intimate gesture associated with care, preparation, and ritual. In death, it becomes a gesture of mourning and farewell. The banshee's comb is not an ornament, but a tool of grief, a way of ordering sorrow, of giving it rhythm. The comb itself is sometimes said to be beautiful, made of silver or bone, catching the light as she uses it. It is not something to be taken lightly. Those who interfere with her, who steal the comb or interrupt her ritual, invite terror. Her grief, when disrupted, turns sharp and relentless. She will pursue the offender, not to kill them, but to reclaim what is hers. This pursuit is not vengeful so much as inevitable, like grief itself demanding acknowledgement. Another common manifestation is that of the washerwoman. In this form, the banshee is seen kneeling by a stream or river, beating clothes against a stone. The clothes are often described as stained, though with what is not always clear. Sometimes they are said to be shrouds. Other times they resemble ordinary garments, made ominous only by the knowledge of what they signify. The sound of cloth striking stone blends with the sound of water, creating a rhythm that echoes the keening cry. This image is particularly powerful because it frames death as preparation rather than event. The banshee is not reacting to death. She's readying its aftermath. She's washing what will soon be needed, attending to the practical realities of loss. This aligns her with domestic labor, traditionally women's work, and underscores her connection to human life rather than abstraction. She is also frequently associated with thresholds. Windows, doors, gates, and bridges are places where she appears or lingers. These are points of transition, neither fully inside nor fully outside, and they mirror her own position between worlds. A banshee at a window is not looking in out of curiosity. She is standing at the edge of a household's future, witnessing what is about to change. When she appears near a house, she does not enter. She remains outside, respecting the boundary between the living and the other world. Her role is not to cross that boundary herself, but to signal that it is about to be crossed by someone else. This restraint is part of what distinguishes her from malevolent spirits. She does not invade, she announces. Despite the fear she inspires, the banshee's presence is often described as strangely calm once the initial shock passes. She does not rush or flail. Even when crying, her movements are deliberate, as though guided by ritual rather than impulse. This calmness suggests that her grief is not personal in the way human grief is. She mourns not because she has lost something she loves, but because loss itself has occurred. Her disappearance is as sudden as her arrival. One moment she is there, solid and undeniable. The next she is gone, leaving no trace. There is no sound of footsteps retreating, no sense of departure. She simply ceases to be present. This reinforces the idea that she does not move through the world in the same way humans do. She appears where she is needed and vanishes when her task is complete. It is worth noting that many people never see her at all. They hear her cry, feel her presence, but never catch sight of her form. This absence of visual confirmation adds to her mystique. She becomes a being known by effect rather than appearance, defined by what she does rather than how she looks. As time passed and belief waned, these appearances became less frequent, or at least less openly discussed. People learned to rationalize what they saw, to reinterpret the old images as shadows, animals, tricks of light. But the stories persisted, carried quietly from one generation to the next. Even those who claim not to believe often admit that if they saw a woman alone by a river at night, combing her hair and crying, they would not approach her. The banshee's appearance is not meant to be catalogued or fixed. She is a mirror, reflecting the fears, customs, and griefs of the people who see her. She looks the way sorrow looks to those who expect her. And in that sense, she's always accurate. She is the shape grief takes when it steps outside the body and walks the land, waiting for the living to catch up. The banshee does not cry for everyone. This is one of the oldest and most defining elements of her lore, and one that gives her a deeply personal character. She is not a wandering spirit announcing death wherever it may fall. She is selective, bound by invisible ties of ancestry, history, and land. Her lament belongs to particular bloodlines, and through them, to particular houses and places. In traditional belief, a banshee follows a family and not an individual. She is inherited, passed down like a name or a story, attached to a lineage that stretches back into the depths of Irish history. When she cries not only for the one who is about to die, but for the family as a whole, acknowledging another break in the chain, another voice about to be silenced. These families are usually old ones, their roots sunk deep into the Irish soil. They are families whose names have endured through centuries of war, famine, and migration, whose ancestors lived and died on the same land for generations. The Banshee's presence among them is often explained as a sign of their antiquity, a mark of having belonged to Ireland long enough to attract the attention of the other world. This belief reflects a worldview in which family identity is not merely biological, but spiritual. Blood carries memory. A family is not just a collection of individuals, but a living continuum, shaped by its past and carrying it forward. The Banshee is the voice of that continuum, mourning each loss not as an isolated event, but as part of a long, unbroken story. In many traditions, each such family has its own Banshee, distinct and recognizable. She may have a particular way of crying, a preferred place to appear, or a specific form she takes when she manifests. Some families speak of her as if she were an old acquaintance, feared but familiar. They know where she tends to be heard, how long her cry usually lasts, and what it has meant in the past. This familiarity does not lessen the dread. If anything, it sharpens it. To hear the cry and recognize it as belonging to one's own family is to know that death is not abstract or distant. It is coming home. The connection between the Banshee and the family is often tied to an ancestral house. Even when family members move away, the Banshee is said to remain loyal to the original home, crying there rather than following individuals across the world. In this way, the house becomes a focal point for grief, a place where the family's dead are symbolically gathered. The Banshee's cry at such a house is a reminder that no matter how far one travels, one's origins remain. This belief speaks to the Irish understanding of place as inseparable from identity. Land is not simply owned, it is inhabited by memory. Fields remember footsteps, walls remember voices. The Banshee, bound to both family and place, moves within this web of remembrance. She is as much a part of the household as the stones in its walls, though she appears only when loss approaches. There are stories of families who lost their ancestral homes through eviction, war, or migration, and with them lost their Banshee. In these tales, the silence that follows is not comforting but unsettling, as though something essential has been severed. The absence of the cry becomes another kind of loss, marking the end of a way of life as surely as the death of a person. Conversely, there are stories of families who gained a Banshee after establishing themselves on land for generations. In these accounts, the first cry is often met with confusion and fear, but later understood as a sign that the family has truly taken root. To have a Banshee is, paradoxically, to belong. Not all families welcomed this idea. Some rejected it, particularly as religious and social attitudes shifted. To claim a Banshee was, for some, to admit to pagan beliefs or superstition. And yet, even among those who denied her existence, the stories persisted. People who would never openly say they believed in a Banshee would still fall silent when a strange cry was heard near the house, still glance at elderly relatives with concern. The Banshee's selectiveness also reinforces her role as a messenger, rather than a menace. She does not cry indiscriminately. Her grief is focused, intentional. She knows whom she serves. This distinguishes her sharply from spirits of chaos or destruction. She operates within a framework of obligation and loyalty. In some traditions, the Banshee's attachment to a family is explained as a reward or a consequence. In others, it is simply a fact requiring no justification. She has always been there and always will be until the family line ends. When the last bearer of a name dies, the Banshee's purpose is fulfilled and she fades away, her task complete. This idea gives her an oddly finite existence. Unlike eternal spirits, she is bound to human time. She begins when a family begins and ends when it does. Her immortality is conditional, dependent on the continuation of blood and memory. In this way, she is as vulnerable as the people she mourns. The relationship between the Banshee and the family is one-sided. She gives warning, but receives no acknowledgement. She's not prayed to or thanked. She does not protect or guide. Her role is limited but essential. She ensures that death does not arrive unnoticed, that it is marked, even if only by fear. This limitation makes her presence all the more poignant. She is bound to grief and nothing else. She cannot intervene. She cannot save. She can only cry. And yet in doing so, she affirms the value of the lives she mourns. Her lament says that this death matters, that it is worthy of notice, that it ripples outward through time and lineage. In a world where death can be anonymous and unremarked, the Banshee insists on remembrance. Through her, the family is reminded of its continuity and its fragility. Each cry is a reckoning, a moment when the living are forced to confront their place in the long line of those who came before and those who will follow. The Banshee does not belong to individuals because individuals pass too quickly. She belongs to families because families endure. And in her cry, all the voices of the past seem to gather, mourning the present and anticipating the future, bound together by blood, land, and the inescapable knowledge that one day every house will hear its last lament. Although the Banshee is most closely associated with Ireland, she is not confined by its borders. Her lament echoes across the wider Gaelic world, taking on new names and forms as it passes through different landscapes, dialects, and traditions. These variations do not contradict the Banshee's nature. They deepen it. They reveal her not as a singular, fixed figure, but as a role that manifests wherever grief, lineage, and the other world intersect. In Ireland herself, the Banshee is already plural in form. She is known by many local names, each emphasizing a different aspect of her character. In some places, she's remembered primarily as the keening woman, defined by her voice alone. In others, she is the white woman, pale and luminous against the dark fields. Elsewhere, she is the woman of the mounds, explicitly tied to the unseen world beneath the hills. These names are not merely labels. They are lenses, shaping how she is perceived and remembered. As the tradition crosses the sea into Scotland, the Banshee becomes more visibly tied to labor and preparation. Here, she is most often known as the washer at the ford, a solitary female figure seen kneeling by water, washing clothes that belong to the soon-to-die. Her presence is quieter, more focused, less overtly terrifying, but no less ominous. She does not always cry. Sometimes she works in silence, the rhythmic sound of fabric striking stone carrying its own dreadful message. The ford is a crucial setting for this figure. It is a place where travelers cross from one side to another, where water must be navigated rather than avoided. In older times, fords were dangerous, uncertain places, especially at night. To see a woman washing clothes there after dark was unsettling enough. To realize that the clothes were burial garments was to understand that the crossing she marked was not merely physical. In this form, the Banshee's role as a preparer of death is foregrounded. She is not announcing loss so much as readying it. The act of washing becomes symbolic of cleansing, of removing the stains of life in preparation for what comes next. It is an intimate act, usually performed by family members for one another, now taken up by a being who belongs to neither world entirely. The washerwoman is often described as small, bent, and strange, with disproportionately long arms or twisted features. In some stories, she appears deformed, as though shaped by the water and stone she works with. This physical distortion reinforces her otherness, marking her as something that has adapted to a liminal existence. She belongs to the edge, to the places where definitions blur. Yet even in this altered form, her essential nature remains intact. She does not cause death. She does not attack. She performs a task that must be done, indifferent to whether she is seen or not. Those who witness her are warned not to interfere, not because she will punish them, but because the work she does is not meant to be interrupted. To stop her is to deny the reality she represents. Across the Gaelic world, water consistently appears as a key element in these stories. Rivers, streams, lakes, and shores are all places where the boundary between worlds is thought to be thinner. Water reflects, distorts, and conceals. It is both life-giving and dangerous. The Banshee's association with water aligns her with transition and passage, reinforcing her role as a guide to the edge rather than a dweller beyond it. In some regions, she is said to be encountered not at water, but at crossroads, another classic liminal space. Crossroads are places of choice, of meeting, of uncertainty. To see the Banshee, there is to be reminded that death is itself a crossing, one that cannot be avoided or delayed once the moment arrives. There are also accounts of malevolent-sounding variants, particularly in later retellings, but these often reflect a shift in tone rather than substance. As oral tradition weakened and stories were retold for entertainment rather than belief, the Banshee's sorrow was sometimes exaggerated into cruelty, her warning into threat. These changes say more about the anxieties of the storytellers than about the figure herself. What unites all these regional forms is restraint. The Banshee, whatever her name or shape, operates within strict limits. She appears briefly. She performs her function. She departs. She does not linger to torment or haunt. Her presence is purposeful, not indulgent. This consistency across regions suggests a shared understanding of death as something that must be acknowledged, but not sensationalized. The differences, meanwhile, reflect local values and environments. In areas where communal labor and domestic ritual were central to life, the Banshee becomes a worker, washing and preparing. In places where oral lament was dominant, she becomes pure sound, a voice in the dark. In regions shaped by ancient myth, she retains traces of divinity, appearing beautiful and distant. In harsher landscapes, she becomes weathered and severe. These variations demonstrate that the Banshee is not a fixed character, but a cultural function. She takes the form that best communicates her message to the people who encounter her. Her essence remains the same, but her expression adapts. As belief in such figures declined, regional distinctions blurred. The washerwoman and the keening woman merged in the popular imagination, becoming a single, generalized Banshee figure. This simplification made her easier to dismiss, but it also erased much of her depth. The old stories, with their careful attention to place and practice, reveal a far more nuanced presence. Even now, traces of these regional forms persist in language and habit. People avoid certain places at night without quite knowing why. They feel uneasy near water after dark. They speak of crossroads with a hint of unease. These instincts are the after-images of old beliefs, the cultural memory of figures like the Banshee lingering beneath conscious thought. In this way, the Banshee survives not only in stories, but in sensibility. She has shaped how people understand loss, transition, and the unseen forces that move alongside everyday life. Her many names are not evidence of confusion, but of richness. They testify to a shared recognition that death is not a single experience, but a series of crossings, each marked in its own way. Whether she cries from a hill, washes by a stream, or waits at a gate, the Banshee fulfills the same role. She stands at the threshold and signals that someone is about to pass. She does not follow them beyond it. She remains behind, bound to the living, carrying the echo of their grief forward into the night. Of all the aspects of the Banshee that have endured, none has been more persistently misunderstood than her purpose. Over time, her cry has been mistaken for a threat, her appearance for an attack, her presence for a curse. Yet in the older understanding, the Banshee is neither predator nor judge. She is a messenger, bound to grief, but innocent of malice. To misunderstand her is to misunderstand the role of mourning itself. The fear she inspires is undeniable. To hear her cry is to feel the nearness of death in a way that few other experiences allow. It strips away abstraction and forces confrontation. But fear does not imply hostility. Storms are feared, as are illnesses and accidents. Yet they are not evil in themselves. The Banshee belongs to this category of forces that terrify because they reveal truths that are otherwise easy to ignore. Her cry is often described as unbearable, a sound that seems to bypass the ears and lodge directly in the chest. It is said to contain many voices at once, rising and falling, breaking into sobs, then reforming into a sustained wail. This description aligns closely with the human practice of keening, a ritualized expression of grief performed at wakes and funerals. In keening, mourners give voice to sorrow on behalf of the community, articulating what others cannot. The Banshee's cry can be understood as an extension of this practice, a supernatural keener who mourns in advance. In this sense, her cry serves a social function. It prepares the family emotionally for loss. It creates a space in which grief can begin before death occurs, softening the shock when it arrives. This anticipatory mourning is not meant to lessen pain, but to integrate it into the rhythm of life, where death is acknowledged as inevitable rather than exceptional. The Banshee's inability to intervene is crucial. She does not warn so that death can be avoided. There is no suggestion in traditional stories that her cry offers an opportunity for escape. Death, once heralded, is already set in motion. Her role is not to change fate, but to mark it. This acceptance of inevitability reflects a world-view in which death is woven into existence, not an anomaly to be defeated. Modern portrayals often invert this understanding. The Banshee becomes a monster whose scream kills or drives people mad. Her grief is transformed into aggression, her sorrow into rage. These versions flatten her complexity and erase her cultural context. They reflect a discomfort with grief itself, a tendency to externalize and vilify what is painful rather than integrate it. In older belief, the Banshee's sorrow is not her own. She does not cry because she is personally invested in the individual who will die. She cries because the death matters. Her grief is impersonal, yet deeply attentive. She acknowledges the weight of loss without being consumed by it. This distinction allows her to remain functional, to continue her role across generations without being destroyed by cumulative sorrow. This impersonal quality also explains why she does not interact with those who hear her. She does not answer questions or offer explanations. To do so would be to personalize her role, to step beyond the bounds of her function. She remains distant, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Her purpose is singular. The misunderstanding of the Banshee is closely tied to broader changes in how death is treated. As death moved out of the home and into institutions, as mourning rituals became private rather than communal, figures like the Banshee lost their place. A being whose sole function is to announce and mourn, death becomes unsettling in a culture that prefers to hide it. In this context, the Banshee's transformation into a monster makes sense. What cannot be integrated is demonized. Her cry, once understood as lament, becomes an attack. Her appearance, once a sign of sorrow, becomes a threat. This shift says less about the Banshee than about the changing relationship between people and mortality. It is telling that in older stories, the Banshee is often described with sympathy. She is pitied for her endless task, for the burden of perpetual mourning. Some accounts even suggest that she is trapped in her role, bound to it by ancient obligations she did not choose. This sympathy disappears in modern retellings, replaced by fear alone. The Banshee's endurance, despite this misunderstanding, speaks to the resilience of the underlying need she represents. People continue to be drawn to her because she addresses something fundamental: the need to acknowledge death as meaningful. Even in distorted forms, she remains a figure through whom anxieties about loss are expressed. Her message, stripped of embellishment, is simple. Someone is going to die. This fact deserves attention. It should not arrive unnoticed or unmarked. The Banshee insists on this acknowledgement, even if it comes at the cost of fear. Understanding her in this way restores her dignity. She's not a creature of chaos, but of order, operating within a moral and cultural framework that values remembrance. Her cry is not an intrusion, but a reminder, one that becomes harder to hear as the world grows louder with distractions. To listen to her properly is not to panic or flee, but to recognize what she announces. Loss is coming. It cannot be prevented. It can only be met. And in that meeting, grief becomes something shared rather than endured alone. There is no story in which the Banshee dies. She does not perish in battle, fade in sunlight, or vanish with a final scream. Instead, she recedes. Her disappearance is gradual, uneven, and ambiguous, marked not by a clear ending, but by a growing quiet. In this way, her fate mirrors that of belief itself, slipping away not through refutation, but through neglect. The decline of the Banshee's presence is inseparable from changes in how people live, die, and remember. In earlier centuries, death was an intimate companion. It occurred in the home, surrounded by family and neighbors. The dying were seen, touched, spoken to. The dead were laid out, mourned aloud, and carried through familiar roads to burial. Grief was public, ritualized, and shared. In such a world, a figure like the Banshee made sense. She externalized what everyone already knew, that death was near, and that it mattered. As life changed, death moved away. Hospitals replaced homes. Professional mourners disappeared. Keening fell silent. Grief became private, often hidden, something to be managed quietly rather than expressed openly. In this new context, the Banshee became an anachronism, a voice from a time when sorrow was allowed to be heard. Urbanization played its part. The landscapes that once held meaning for the Banshee, fields, rivers, ancestral houses, were altered or abandoned. Families scattered, severing the long continuity that had sustained belief in a spirit bound to lineage. A Banshee attached to a family loses her place when the family itself becomes fragmented, its members spread across continents, its shared memory diluted. Language, too, shifted. As Irish and Scottish Gaelic declined, so did the worldview embedded within them. Words that carried layers of meaning. Terms for land, kinship, and the unseen were replaced by more utilitarian speech. The Banshee's many names faded, collapsed into a single, simplified figure stripped of nuance. What remained was easier to dismiss, but also easier to misunderstand. Religious change further complicated her place. As doctrines hardened, older beliefs were increasingly framed as superstition or heresy. The Banshee, once integrated into a worldview that accommodated both the sacred and the mysterious, became suspect. People learned to deny her existence publicly, even if privately they still felt her presence in moments of loss. And yet, she never fully vanished. Stories persisted, often told with a half smile, a disclaimer of disbelief quickly followed by a detailed recollection. People claimed not to believe, then described the cry they heard before a relative died, the strange woman seen near the house, the feeling that something was wrong long before news arrived. These stories were offered cautiously, as if belief itself had become a liability. This tension between disbelief and experience is where the Banshee now resides. She survives not as a certainty, but as a possibility. She lingers in the space between rational explanation and intuitive knowing, where people are reluctant to assert belief, but equally reluctant to deny what they felt. Modern interpretations often treat her as a symbol rather than a being. She becomes a metaphor for grief, for premonition, for the subconscious recognition of impending loss. While this symbolic reading preserves some of her meaning, it also distances her from the lived reality of those who once expected her as part of the world. For them, she was not an idea, but a presence, as real as the sound of wind or the creak of a floorboard at night. The persistence of the banshee in popular culture, even in distorted forms, suggests that she fulfills a need that has not disappeared. People continue to seek ways to personify death, to give it a face and a voice that can be confronted. The problem is not that the banshee no longer speaks, but that fewer people are willing to listen. In rural areas, particularly among older generations, her memory is more resilient. There are still those who lower their voices when speaking of her, who avoid certain places after dark, who take sudden silence before a death as something more than coincidence. These habits are not always conscious acts of belief. They are inherited responses, reflexes shaped by stories heard too young to question. The banshee's fading is therefore incomplete. She has not been erased so much as submerged. She exists beneath the surface of modern life, emerging in moments of vulnerability, when rational defenses are lowered by grief or fear. In these moments, her cry is not heard with the ears, but with something deeper. Her silence in the present does not invalidate her past. It marks a change in how people relate to the forces she represents. Death has not become less powerful or less frightening. It has simply become less communal. The banshee thrived in a world where grief belonged to everyone. Her decline reflects the isolation of mourning rather than its disappearance. In this sense, the banshee's waning is a loss of its own, not because she is gone, but because what she offered, a shared acknowledgement of death, has become rare. Her absence leaves grief unannounced, unritualized, and often unspoken. And yet the possibility remains that she could return, not as a literal figure walking the fields, but as a renewed understanding of what her cry meant. In moments when people gather again to mourn, to speak names aloud, to treat death as a passage rather than a failure, the banshee's function is quietly fulfilled, even if her form is not seen. She has always adapted. She has changed shape, voice, and name across centuries. Her current silence may simply be another transformation, one that reflects a world not yet ready to hear her again. The banshee endures because she speaks to something that does not change. Long after the fields have emptied, the houses fallen, and the names forgotten, death remains. It arrives without asking permission, without regard for belief or disbelief. What changes is how it is met. In the world that shaped the banshee, death was neither hidden nor dramatized. It was acknowledged, prepared for, and mourned collectively. The banshee's cry was part of this process. She did not soften death, but she framed it. She gave it context, rhythm, and voice. Her lament told the living that what was about to happen mattered enough to be marked. To modern ears, her cry sounds cruel. Why announce loss before it arrives? Why burden people with foreknowledge? But this question assumes that ignorance is kinder than awareness. The older tradition suggests otherwise. To be warned is to be given time, not to prevent death, but to begin grieving, to say what might otherwise remain unsaid, to hold more tightly while there is still breath. The banshee does not offer comfort in the way people often want it. She does not reassure. She does not promise reunion or justice. Her comfort, if it can be called that, lies in recognition. She recognizes the weight of a life ending. She refuses to let it pass unnoticed. In doing so, she affirms the dignity of both the dead and the living. The dead are worthy of mourning. The living are capable of bearing it. Her cry assumes resilience even as it exposes vulnerability. That is why she is not evil. Evil seeks to diminish, to harm for its own sake. The Banshee seeks only to announce what is already set in motion. Her sorrow is not an attack, but a witness. She stands beside loss, not above it. The fear she inspires is inseparable from the truth she carries. To hear her is to be reminded of mortality, of the fragility of bloodlines and homes, of the fact that every family story will one day end. This reminder is uncomfortable, but it is also grounding. It places individual lives within a larger pattern, one that extends backward and forward beyond personal experience. In a world that often treats death as failure or anomaly, the Banshee offers a different perspective. Death is not a mistake. It is a passage that deserves ceremony. The problem is not that death exists, but that it is so often denied the space it requires. The Banshee's absence today is therefore not a triumph of progress, but a symptom of disconnection. When grief is privatized and hurried, when mourning is expected to be brief and discreet, there is no place for a figure whose sole purpose is to cry. And yet, people still listen for her. Not consciously, perhaps, but instinctively. They sense when something is wrong. They dream of voices calling in the night. They feel a heaviness before news arrives. These experiences are often dismissed, explained away, but they persist because they answer a need that rationality does not address. The Banshee does not demand belief. She does not punish disbelief. She simply exists where belief once lived, waiting for those willing to acknowledge her message. Whether understood as spirit, symbol, or inherited memory, her role remains relevant. She is the woman who cries, so others do not have to cry alone. She is the voice that says, "This death matters," and as long as death continues to matter, which is to say, as long as people love, remember, and belong, her lament will never fully fade.